has been a part of indigenous legal systems around the world for thousands of years. Whether it's the Haida on the west coast of Canada, the Anishinaabe in central Canada, or the Mi'kmaq on the east coast here, this is a cornerstone of indigenous law. And it wasn't until the 1960s that Rachel Carson, the environmental visionary and author of Silent Spring, she's the first person who actually started advocating for recognition of a human right to a healthy environment in the Western world. And her vision actually was picked up in the first global eco summit, which took place in Sweden in 1972, resulted in the Stockholm Declaration, which for the first time formally recognized that everyone has the right to live in a healthy environment and a responsibility to protect the environment. Now, the Stockholm Declaration wasn't a legally binding document, but in the 40 years since it was put together, it has had a profound influence on environmental law around the world and on constitutional law around the world. And so, for just one example of its influence, there are now regional human rights agreements covering the Americas, covering Europe, covering Africa, and parts of Asia that recognize in these human rights agreements that everyone has the right to live in a healthy environment. And 118 different countries have ratified those legally binding human rights agreements. And when we're talking about the right to a healthy environment, it really has two aspects. One is a substantive aspect and the other is a procedural aspect. And the substantive aspect is really common sense that humans have a right to breathe clean air, drink safe water, live in a non-toxic environment, and enjoy the benefits of healthy ecosystems. Those are the kind of four substantive cornerstones. And then on the procedural side, in order to fulfill those substantive rights, humans have a right to access to information, to participate in decision-making about the environment, and where their right is in jeopardy of being violated, a right to access the legal system to try and enforce that right. So my research, the first thing I did when I was starting to investigate the constitutional recognition of the right to a healthy environment was to go down into the dark and dusty basement of the library at the University of British Columbia and read 200 constitutions. It's not an activity I would recommend to any of you, particularly students. But what I found was quite extraordinary, that in the years since 1972, over 140 countries have put into their constitutions an obligation on governments to protect the environment. This slide's slightly out of date because the numbers keep changing. 95 countries now recognize in their constitutions that there is a human right to a healthy environment, on par with the human right to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to vote, right to fair trial, is this right to a healthy environment. 84 constitutions also impose a responsibility on individuals to protect the environment, and about 30 contain procedural rights that are specific to environmental protection. And these, as I said, the first countries to actually include the right to a healthy environment in the Constitution were Portugal in 1976 and Spain in 1978. And that process accelerated through the 1970s and 80s, peaked in the 1990s, and continues today. So last year, Bangladesh, Jamaica, Morocco, and South Sudan, for the first time, put environmental provisions into their constitutions. This year, Syria, Somalia, Zambia, and most recently Iceland have all put environmental provisions into their constitution for the first time. If somebody wants to ask me a question about Iceland afterwards, I'd love to. There's a funny story about how that came about. And in some of these constitutions, there's just one very brief reference to environmental protection. In others, there are literally pages and pages of detail about how the environment should be protected. For example, in Ecuador's constitution, there are over 30 pages of provisions. And so this is just a graphic representation of what I've just been talking about. These are the countries of the world that have included in their constitutions provisions related to environmental protection. Now, some of you who aren't lawyers may be wondering, well, why focus on constitutions? And the answer to that is that constitutions are the supreme or highest law of a country. All laws, regulations, policies, and standards have to be consistent with the Constitution, or they can be struck down, rendered invalid. There's a compelling legal reason for focusing on constitutions. But there's also a cultural reason, and that's that a constitution is intended to reflect our deepest and most cherished values. As a South African judge once wrote, a constitution is like a mirror of a nation's soul. And so for people like Canadians for whom environmental protection is a fundamental value, we should have that in our constitution to reflect who we are as a people and who we aspire to be as a people. So this is constitutional provisions related to the environment in general, and the second map is constitutional provisions specifically recognizing the right to live in a healthy environment. See, it's completely universal throughout Latin America, common in Western Europe, universal in Eastern Europe, common in Africa, and to a lesser extent in Asia. And of course, the white spot on North America is a sort of ongoing concern. I want to just briefly say that there has been a real innovation in the constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador. Not only do these countries recognize the right of people to live in a healthy environment, but in their new constitutions, they recognize the rights of nature itself. And so this again stems from the influence of indigenous people in Bolivia and Ecuador. And when these constitutions first came out in 2008 and 2009, there was a lot of skepticism in the legal community about whether this was just kind of fancy-sounding rhetoric. And in the last 3 or 4 years, it's proven to be something real. This is the Rio Vilcabamba in Ecuador. This is a river which was damaged by a highway construction project. Some Ecuadorians brought a lawsuit on behalf of the river, and an Ecuador court agreed that the river's constitutional rights had been violated, and that it had a right to be restored. So the Ecuador government was forced to do a restoration project there. In Bolivia, they've got a new law called the Law on the Rights of Mother Earth, which not only goes into detail about what those rights entail, but also assigns responsibilities to government, to businesses, and to citizens to protect those rights, and creates a special ombudsperson to look after the rights of nature. And Bolivia has also led a discussion at the international level on the creation of a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, kind of the next generation universal declaration of human rights. So the right to a healthy environment in a very short span of time has gained recognition all around the world. And what I really wanted to find out was, does that make a difference? Because I'm an environmental activist first, and a lawyer, professor second and third. And so to me, I wanted to delve into the question of what difference does it really make? Is it a paper tiger, or as James Madison once said, a parchment barrier? Or does it have the potential to act as a catalyst for the transformation of societies into cleaner and greener, more sustainable societies? So the first thing I looked at was, does constitutional recognition of the right to a healthy environment impact environmental laws and policies in a country? And I was doing, as a mature student, I was doing doctoral work on this about 6 years ago. And I had real trouble deciding which handful of countries I should use as case studies. So I did all 92. And I looked at the environmental legislation of 92 countries. It was a very fun project to do. Used a lot of translation and digging around. And it turned out that 78 of the 92 countries whose constitutions recognize the right to a healthy environment have since changed their environmental laws to strengthen them and to focus on fulfilling that basic and fundamental human right. In some countries, they've changed their overall framework law. In other countries, they've changed every environmental law and policy they have to focus on fulfilling the right to a healthy environment. And in the 14 countries where there has been no change, the majority of those are actually sub-Saharan African nations where they face such terrible political, economic, and social crises. It's not really surprising that no changes have been made. And so then the question is, do these environmental laws make a difference? Well, let me just give you a few examples. This is a rare ecosystem in Colombia, in South America, called the Paramo. Colombians call it the water factory because it only makes up 2% of the country of the land area of Colombia, but it provides drinking water to 70% of the people. And a mining company wants to build an open pit gold mine right there in the heart of the Paramo. Of course, it's a Canadian mining company, called Greystar Resources. Well, and it's $1 billion proposal. I mean, thousands of jobs, economic benefits, the usual, yada, yada. Last year, the government of Colombia said, no, gracias. We don't want your open pit gold mine in our country. It would violate our constitutional right to a healthy environment. So that's a tremendous example of the power of this.